Hospitals are supposed to be sanctuaries, the place where fragile lives are preserved, where pain is soothed, where healing begins. But in the late 1970s and early 1980s, in the state of Texas, one nurse transformed those very halls of mercy into hunting grounds. Her name was Genene Jones, and her story remains one of the darkest stains on American medical history. Genene Jones was born in 1950 in Texas, adopted as an infant, and raised in a middle-class home. Outwardly, her life seemed ordinary, but those who knew her often described her as deeply insecure, desperate for attention, and hungry for validation. Nursing became her chosen profession, a role that gave her instant authority, admiration, and, most importantly, control over life and death. By the late 1970s, Jones was working as a licensed vocational nurse at the Bexar County Hospital in San Antonio, Texas, a facility that would later become University Hospital. She was assigned to the pediatric intensive care unit, where some of the sickest, most fragile children in the region were treated. It was here that whispers began. Doctors and nurses noticed a disturbing pattern. Whenever Genene Jones was on duty, children who had been stable would suddenly deteriorate. Infants who had been on the road to recovery would inexplicably crash. Alarms would blare, staff would scramble, and more often than not, Genene was at the center of it all. At first, her colleagues saw her as heroic. She always seemed to be there in the middle of an emergency, rushing in to perform CPR, shouting orders, drawing attention. But over time, the coincidences became too sharp to ignore. The truth, as investigators would later reveal, was horrifying. Genene Jones wasn't the savior she pretended to be. She was the cause of the emergencies. She had developed a chilling method, injecting children with drugs that would induce sudden, catastrophic medical crises. Most frequently, she used succinylcholine, a powerful muscle relaxant that causes paralysis, or digoxin, a heart medication that can be deadly in high doses. In some cases, she used heparin, a blood thinner, to trigger uncontrolled bleeding. Her victims were infants and toddlers, the most defenseless patients in the hospital. Once she had created the emergency, Jones would leap into action, playing the role of the frantic but skilled nurse fighting to save the child's life. Sometimes the child survived, leaving Genene showered with praise. But too often, the child died, and her colleagues were left baffled by the mysterious, unexplainable deaths. Psychologists later argued that Jones was likely suffering from Munchausen syndrome by proxy, a disorder in which caretakers deliberately harm those in their care in order to gain attention, sympathy, or praise. But others believe it went beyond that Jones derived a twisted sense of power from holding life and death in her hands. By the early 1980s, the pattern was undeniable. In the pediatric ICU, the mortality rate had skyrocketed. Children who should have recovered were dying at alarming rates. When administrators examined the records, one name surfaced over and over again: Genene Jones. The suspicion grew so strong that, in 1982, she was quietly pushed out of Bexar County Hospital. But instead of reporting her to the police or revoking her license, administrators did what many institutions have done in similar cases. They simply let her resign, hoping to avoid scandal. It was a decision that would prove catastrophic. Jones quickly found work at a small pediatric clinic in Kerrville, Texas, run by a physician named Dr. Kathleen Holland. It was here, in this small-town clinic, that Jones's killing spree reached its most infamous moment. In September 1982, a cheerful, healthy 15-month-old girl named Chelsea McClellan was brought in by her mother for routine immunizations. Chelsea was the kind of child who lit up a room, bright-eyed, playful, adored by her parents. When Jones administered the injection, Chelsea's mother noticed her daughter suddenly slumping, her body going limp. Panic filled the room. Jones immediately took control, rushing to perform CPR, shouting for help, acting the part of the heroic nurse fighting to save a child's life. But it was too late. Chelsea was gone. The official explanation? A rare and tragic reaction to a vaccine. But in reality, Chelsea had been murdered, poisoned with a deliberate overdose of a muscle relaxant. Dr. Holland, who had once trusted Jones, began to notice troubling signs. Children in her clinic were suffering from inexplicable emergencies, fainting spells, seizures. The more Holland looked at her records, the more suspicious she became. Could it really be coincidence that so many emergencies occurred only when Genene was on duty? Her suspicions reached a breaking point after Chelsea's death. Holland alerted authorities, and finally, an investigation was launched. In 1983, Genene Jones was arrested and charged with murder. Investigators began combing through her history, uncovering a chilling possibility. She may have been responsible for the deaths of dozens, perhaps even hundreds of children. Some estimates suggest that between 40 and 60 young patients may have died as a direct result of her actions. But proving it was another matter. Many of the children had been cremated, and medical records from Behar County Hospital had mysteriously disappeared, allegedly destroyed in a mass purge of old files. This left prosecutors with little physical evidence to work with. They decided to focus on one undeniable case: the murder of Chelsea McClellan. At trial, prosecutors argued that Jones had deliberately injected Chelsea with a lethal dose of succinylcholine, paralyzing her muscles until she could no longer breathe. They painted a picture of a nurse who craved attention, who engineered crises so she could play the hero. The defense countered that Jones was a dedicated professional being scapegoated for the hospital's broader problems. But the evidence was overwhelming. The jury convicted her of murder, and in 1984, Genene Jones was sentenced to 99 years in prison. Even after her conviction, questions lingered. How many children had truly died at her hands? Some former colleagues believe the number could be as high as 60. Others say it could be more. But without physical evidence, most cases were impossible to prove. For decades, Jones remained behind bars. But then came another twist. Under Texas law at the time, she was eligible for early release due to good behavior, meaning that this woman, convicted of murdering a baby and suspected of killing dozens more, could walk free after serving only a fraction of her sentence. The prospect sent shockwaves through the families of her suspected victims. Public outrage grew. Prosecutors scrambled to prevent her release. In 2017, with her potential release looming, prosecutors brought new charges against Jones. They had reopened investigations into several child deaths from the early 1980s, and advances in medical forensics allowed them to build stronger cases. Jones was indicted on 5 new counts of murder related to the deaths of children at Behar County Hospital. Faced with mounting evidence and the possibility of additional life sentences, Jones ultimately pleaded guilty to the murder of 11-month-old Joshua Sawyer, one of her suspected victims. In 2020, she was sentenced to life in prison, ensuring she would never walk free again. The story of Genene Jones left deep scars on Texas and on the entire medical community. The story of Genene Jones left deep scars on Texas and on the entire medical community. She had been entrusted with the most precious of lives, and she used that trust as a weapon. Her actions forced hospitals to rethink oversight, to implement stricter protocols, to watch for patterns of unexplained deaths. But for the families who lost children under her care, no policy change could erase the pain. To them, Jones wasn't just a nurse. She was the embodiment of betrayal. What drove Genene Jones? Experts still debate. Some say it was Munchausen by proxy, a desperate need for attention and validation. Others argue it was something darker, a sadistic thrill from wielding power over life and death. In court, one psychologist described her as someone who created emergencies so that she could be the center of the storm. But regardless of motive, the consequences were the same. Innocent children, robbed of futures, their parents left with grief that time cannot heal. Genene Jones showed the world that evil can wear a nurse's uniform, that the line between healer and killer can be terrifyingly thin. She turned hospitals into hunting grounds, and her legacy is a reminder that sometimes the deadliest predators are not strangers in the dark, but the very people we trust to keep us alive. They called her kind. They called her gentle. Colleagues described her as soft-spoken, polite, and utterly devoted to the fragile infants in her care. But behind Lucy Letby's quiet smile was a darkness so chilling that it would shake the very foundations of Britain's trust in its healthcare system. Lucy Letby was born in 1990 in Hereford, England. To friends, she was ordinary, almost invisible in her normalcy. She went on to study nursing at the University of Chester, eventually landing what many considered a dream job, a neonatal nurse at the Countess of Chester Hospital. To parents, she appeared as the reassuring presence you hope for when your newborn is fighting for life. She wrote cards to families, took photographs of babies, and spoke of her passion for helping the most vulnerable. But beneath the surface, something sinister was stirring. Between 2015 and 2016, a wave of unexpected tragedies swept through the hospital's neonatal ward. Babies who had been stable suddenly collapsed. Tiny lungs stopped breathing. Hearts stopped beating. Resuscitations failed. Parents were left clutching lifeless infants, bewildered by how quickly hope had turned into devastation. At first, doctors searched for explanations. Undetected infections, congenital defects, sheer misfortune. But the pattern became too clear to ignore. In each inexplicable collapse, one name surfaced again and again. Lucy Letby was on duty. The methods she used were chilling in their simplicity and cruelty. Prosecutors later revealed that Letby injected air into the bloodstream of infants, causing fatal embolisms. In other cases, she poisoned babies with insulin or deliberately overfed them milk, rupturing their tiny stomachs. These were not accidents. They were deliberate, calculated acts, carried out by the very person entrusted to keep these infants alive. One father later recalled how his premature twins, born fighting but stable, suddenly collapsed on the ward. One died. The other survived, but barely. He would only learn years later that both had been attacked by Letby. Doctors raised concerns, whispering about the grim coincidences that seemed to follow Letby's every shift. But in an institution where accusing a nurse of murder felt unthinkable, warnings were brushed aside. Senior staff were hesitant, worried about reputational damage. For months, Letby continued her deadly routine, blending in as the diligent nurse who cared too much. The breakthrough came when a group of consultants pressed harder, demanding investigations. A review of hospital records revealed a devastating pattern. When Letby worked, babies died or collapsed at a shocking rate. When she was off shift, the ward returned to relative normalcy. In July 2018, Letby was finally arrested at her home. Detectives found chilling evidence, handwritten notes that seemed to be both confessions and self-loathing manifestos. One note read, "I am evil. I did this." The trial, held in 2022 and 2023, became one of the most harrowing in British legal history. Parents sat in court, reliving the most traumatic days of their lives. Doctors testified about their suspicions, their frustration at being ignored, their horror at realizing their instincts had been right. Prosecutors painted Letby as a cold, calculating killer who sought power and control over the most helpless of victims. After months of testimony, the jury delivered its verdict. Lucy Letby was guilty of murdering 7 infants and attempting to murder 6 more. She was sentenced to a rare punishment in the UK, life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. The aftermath rippled far beyond the walls of the courtroom. Families demanded answers. How could warnings have been ignored for so long? Why had management silenced whistleblowers? Investigations into hospital leadership were launched, and calls for sweeping reforms in patient safety grew louder. To this day, Lucy Letby's name evokes a visceral reaction. She had been the face parents looked to in their most vulnerable moments, the nurse who smiled and reassured them as she destroyed their world. Her betrayal was not only of patience, but of trust itself, the sacred bond between caregiver and those they serve. Letby's case is a chilling reminder that evil doesn't always wear a mask of rage or cruelty. Sometimes it smiles, sometimes it speaks softly, and sometimes it is the very person you're most desperate to believe in. Lucy Letby showed the world that even in the place most associated with healing and hope, the greatest danger can come from the person standing at your child's bedside. Hospitals are built on trust, a sacred bond between caregiver and patient. But in the early 1990s, in a quiet English town, a nurse shattered that bond in ways almost too horrifying to imagine. She was known as Beverley Allitt, and her name would forever be linked with betrayal, death, and the innocent children whose lives she stole. Beverley Allitt was born on October 4, 1968, in the village of Corby Glen, Lincolnshire, England. She was the second of 4 children, raised in what seemed like an ordinary working-class household. But beneath the surface, there were warning signs. From a young age, Beverley craved attention. She was described as manipulative, prone to exaggeration, and strangely drawn to medical environments. In her teens, she began visiting doctors obsessively for minor complaints and often wore bandages or casts without any apparent injury. Later, psychiatric experts would suggest that she displayed signs of Munchausen syndrome, a disorder where individuals feign illness to receive sympathy or care. Despite poor grades and a history of truancy, Allitt pursued a career in nursing. She trained at Grantham College and qualified as a state-enrolled nurse in 1991. Soon after, she was hired at Grantham and Kesteven Hospital in Lincolnshire. Her colleagues saw her as quiet and unremarkable. Few could have predicted the nightmare that was about to unfold. Allitt was assigned to Ward 4, the children's ward of the hospital. It was a small, close-knit unit where local families brought their sick children for care. For parents, it was a place of reassurance. For Allitt, it became a stage, one where she would play the role of both destroyer and savior. Within weeks of her arrival, doctors and nurses began noticing a disturbing pattern. Previously stable children would suddenly collapse, their breathing failing, their hearts stopping. Code blue after code blue echoed through the halls. No one understood why. But one thing was clear. When these crises occurred, Beverley Allitt was almost always on duty. Between February and April of 1991, a shocking series of medical emergencies unfolded on Ward 4. A 7-year-old Liam Taylor was admitted with a chest infection. Under Allitt's care, he suddenly went into cardiac arrest. Despite resuscitation efforts, Liam died. His parents were devastated, believing it to be a tragic complication of illness. 11-year-old Timothy Hardwick, a boy with cerebral palsy, was next. He suffered a sudden seizure, leading to cardiac arrest. Allitt was the nurse in charge. He too died. A 1-year-old Becky Phillips came in with a mild chest infection. After being treated, she seemed to recover. But shortly after, under Allitt's watch, she collapsed. She died quickly. Her twin sister, Katie, was admitted the very next day for observation. What happened next shocked, even hardened investigators. While under Allitt's care, Katie Phillips suddenly collapsed. She was resuscitated, but the lack of oxygen left her permanently brain damaged. Katie survived, but she would need lifelong medical care. And the deaths didn't stop there. 5-month-old Paul Crampton experienced unexplained insulin-induced hypoglycemia, his blood sugar dropping so low that he nearly died. 5-year-old Bradley Gibson suffered sudden heart attacks. 2-year-old Kaylee Desmond collapsed unexpectedly. In total, over just 59 days, 4 children died and 9 more were left fighting for their lives. Investigators later discovered that Allitt had been deliberately harming the children. Her preferred weapons were insulin overdoses and air injections into veins, which can cause catastrophic air embolisms. In some cases, she administered lethal doses of potassium chloride, a drug that causes fatal heart arrhythmias. Why did she do it? Some experts point to Munchausen syndrome by proxy, harming others to gain attention and sympathy. Others believe she derived a darker satisfaction from creating chaos and playing the hero during resuscitations. Whatever the motive, the result was the same. Innocent children became pawns in her deadly game. By the spring of 1991, doctors at Grantham and Kesteven were alarmed. The number of deaths and near-deaths on Ward 4 was abnormally high. One pediatric consultant, Dr. Nelson Porter, began reviewing the cases. He noticed the same nurse was present during almost every unexplained collapse. Beverley Allitt. Hospital administrators ordered an internal review, but the process was slow. Meanwhile, Allitt continued to work on the ward, and children continued to suffer. It wasn't until the near-death of Paul Crampton, who survived multiple unexplained hypoglycemic episodes, that suspicions became undeniable. Paul was transferred to another hospital, where doctors confirmed he had been given massive doses of insulin, far more than any child should ever receive. This revelation blew the case wide open. Police were called in. Detectives quickly narrowed their focus to Ward 4, compiling medical charts, interviewing staff, and testing blood samples. What they found was chilling. Blood tests confirmed dangerously high insulin levels in several children, including those who had died. In cases where potassium was suspected, postmortem tests showed abnormally elevated levels. And in every case, one name reappeared: Beverley Allitt. In November 1991, she was arrested. Allitt's trial began in 1993 at Nottingham Crown Court. By then, the media had branded her the Angel of Death. Prosecutors accused her of 4 counts of murder, 11 counts of attempted murder, and 11 counts of grievous bodily harm. They argued that Allitt had used her position of trust to inflict suffering on defenseless children, craving the drama and attention that followed medical emergencies. The defense painted her as mentally ill, claiming she suffered from personality disorders and Munchausen syndrome by proxy. They argued that she should be hospitalized rather than imprisoned. The jury heard harrowing testimony from parents, doctors, and experts. They saw medical records showing lethal levels of drugs administered while Allitt was the nurse on duty. They learned about the children who survived but would live with lifelong disabilities, like Katie Phillips, who was left blind, partially deaf, and brain damaged after Allitt's attack. The evidence was overwhelming. In May 1993, Beverley Allitt was convicted on all major charges. She was sentenced to 13 life sentences, making her one of the most notorious female serial killers in British history. Allitt was initially sent to Rampton Secure Hospital, a high-security psychiatric facility in Nottinghamshire, rather than a traditional prison. There, she received psychiatric treatment and remained under heavy supervision. Her case sparked widespread debate in Britain. Should someone who murdered innocent children under the guise of medical care be treated as mentally ill or punished as a criminal? For the families of the victims, there was no debate at all. They had lost children in the most brutal betrayal imaginable. The legacy of Beverley Allitt's crimes was profound. Hospitals across the UK introduced stricter checks, tighter drug controls, and more rigorous supervision of pediatric wards. The scandal forced the medical community to confront a chilling truth: that even in the safest places, trust could be shattered from within. For the survivors, life was forever changed. Katie Phillips, who lived but with permanent brain damage, became a symbol of both tragedy and resilience. Her parents, who had lost one twin to Allitt and nearly lost the other, carried unimaginable grief. Experts still struggle to explain Allitt's crimes. Some argue she sought sympathy and attention. Others suggest she had a compulsion to control life and death. One psychiatrist described her as a deeply disturbed woman who sought power through the suffering of others. Whatever her motive, her actions revealed the terrifying reality of an angel of death figure, a caregiver who becomes the executioner. Beverley Allitt showed that evil can hide behind a nurse's gentle smile, that the very person entrusted with saving children could instead destroy them. Her crimes remind us that sometimes the most dangerous predators wear the mask of compassion and strike in the very places we feel safest. Hospitals are supposed to be sanctuaries of healing, places where compassion meets science to restore life. But in the mid-1990s, at a veterans medical center in Massachusetts, patients who had survived wars began dying in their hospital beds. Not from illness, not from old age, but from the hands of the very nurse sworn to protect them. Her name was Kristen Gilbert, and she would go down in history as one of America's most notorious angels of death. Kristen Heather Strickland, later known as Kristen Gilbert, was born on November 13, 1967, in Fall River, Massachusetts. Outwardly, she seemed destined for success. She was intelligent, ambitious, and charming, the type of young woman parents hoped their daughters might emulate. She studied nursing at Greenfield Community College and later at Mount Wachusett Community College. In 1988, she married Glenn Gilbert and began what appeared to be a conventional life: a suburban marriage, a nursing career, and later 2 children. But behind closed doors, there were darker traits. Friends and acquaintances recalled her as manipulative, controlling, and prone to lying. She often fabricated illnesses or exaggerated crises to draw attention. Those who knew her closely saw someone who craved power and drama. By the early 1990s, Kristen Gilbert secured a position at the Veterans Affairs Medical Center in Northampton, Massachusetts. It was here that her deadly impulses would take root. The Northampton VA Medical Center cared for some of the nation's most vulnerable patients, elderly veterans struggling with chronic illnesses, PTSD, and long-term care needs. For them, nurses were not just medical professionals but lifelines. At first, Gilbert appeared to be a model nurse. She was efficient, knowledgeable, and quick to respond in emergencies. Colleagues admired her ability to take control when patients went into distress. But soon, a troubling pattern emerged. Between 1995 and 1996, the ward began experiencing a sudden spike in cardiac arrests. Elderly men, some stable and expected to recover, suddenly collapsed without warning. Code blues, the emergency alerts for resuscitation, were being called with unusual frequency. The most disturbing part? Almost every time a patient coded, Kristen Gilbert was on duty. Investigators later discovered that Gilbert had been deliberately inducing cardiac arrests by injecting patients with massive doses of epinephrine, adrenaline. In small amounts, epinephrine can restart a failing heart. In large, uncontrolled doses, it does the opposite. It throws the heart into chaos, causing arrhythmias, seizures, and ultimately death. Why epinephrine? Because it was readily available on the ward, and because sudden cardiac arrests were not uncommon among elderly patients. It was the perfect weapon, easy to disguise as a natural event. Once the patient collapsed, Gilbert was often the first to respond. She would rush in, barking orders, administering CPR, and directing colleagues. To her coworkers, she seemed like a hero, the nurse always in the thick of crisis, fighting to save lives. But in reality, she had staged the drama herself. Not everyone was fooled. Some nurses began whispering about the strange coincidences. Why were so many codes happening during Gilbert's shifts? Why did stable patients suddenly collapse under her care? The pattern was too stark to ignore. In fact, the rate of cardiac emergencies on the ward was 3 times higher when Gilbert was present. When she was on vacation, the codes mysteriously dropped. When she returned, the deaths began again. Colleagues reported their concerns to hospital administrators. At first, the whispers were brushed aside. After all, accusing a nurse of killing patients was almost unthinkable. But as the numbers mounted, the suspicions hardened into certainty. Something was terribly wrong. In 1996, the hospital formally launched an inquiry. Around the same time, Gilbert's personal life was unraveling. Her marriage was collapsing, and she had begun an affair with a VA police officer named James Perot. The relationship was intense, volatile, and filled with drama. Colleagues noticed that Gilbert seemed to thrive on crisis. She loved the adrenaline, the attention, and the power that came with life-or-death situations. It wasn't just about killing, it was about control. Federal investigators quietly began monitoring the ward. Autopsies were ordered on suspicious deaths, and vials of medication were tested. Sure enough, several victims showed sky-high levels of epinephrine in their blood, doses no doctor had prescribed. When investigators tried to piece together Gilbert's motives, they found something disturbing. Some believed she killed simply for attention, to appear as the heroic nurse saving lives in dramatic emergencies. Others suggested she enjoyed the chaos, the feeling of power that came from holding life and death in her hands. But there was also a more personal angle. During her affair with Perot, Gilbert seemed to crave his admiration. By staging emergencies, she could show off her skills, making herself look indispensable. One theory suggests she created the crises to draw Perot, who often responded to emergencies, closer to her. In short, her murders may have been part of a twisted love story, killing for attention, drama, and validation. In July 1996, Kristen Gilbert resigned from the VA hospital under mounting suspicion. But the investigation pressed on. By 1998, she was formally indicted on charges of 4 counts of murder, 3 counts of attempted murder, and several counts of assault. The government spared no expense in prosecuting her case. Given that the crimes occurred at a federal facility, the trial was held in federal court. Gilbert's trial began in November 2000 in Springfield, Massachusetts. The courtroom was packed with the families of veterans who had died under her care. Prosecutors presented a damning case. The sudden spike in deaths, the epinephrine evidence, the testimonies of fellow nurses, and the chilling consistency of Gilbert's presence during each collapse. They argued that she had abused her position of trust to become a serial killer, one who preyed on the very men who had once risked their lives for their country. The defense countered that the patients were already critically ill, that heart attacks were not unusual in such a population, and that the evidence was circumstantial. They painted Gilbert as a scapegoat, a victim of workplace gossip and statistical coincidence. But the prosecution had one more card to play: Gilbert's disturbing behavior outside the hospital. In 1998, while under investigation, she had reportedly called in a bomb threat to the VA hospital, an act prosecutors said showed her need to create drama and chaos. After weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated. In March 2001, they delivered their verdict. Kristen Gilbert was guilty on all major charges. Because the crimes took place at a federal facility, Gilbert faced the possibility of the death penalty. Prosecutors pushed for it, arguing that she had murdered veterans in cold blood. In the end, the jury spared her life. Kristen Gilbert was sentenced to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. She remains incarcerated at Federal Medical Center Carswell in Fort Worth, Texas, a prison facility for female inmates with special medical needs. For the families of her victims, the sentence was small comfort. Men who had survived wars, who had endured the hardships of combat and age, had died not on the battlefield but in a hospital bed, betrayed by a nurse whose duty was to protect them. The VA hospital system faced intense scrutiny. Families demanded answers. How could a nurse kill multiple patients without detection? Why hadn't administrators acted sooner on staff concerns? The scandal forced the Veterans Affairs system to tighten controls, increase oversight, and improve medication security. But for many, it was too late. Experts have long debated what drove Gilbert. Was she a classic angel of death, motivated by power and control? Was it a psychological compulsion to create emergencies? Or was it, as some argued, simply about attention and validation, a deadly form of narcissism? Whatever the motive, Gilbert's crimes stand as one of the most egregious betrayals of medical trust in U.S. history. Kristen Gilbert's story reminds us that even those who wear the uniform of compassion can be driven by motives as dark as any criminals. In the veterans' ward of a Massachusetts hospital, the nurse who was supposed to heal instead delivered death, proving once again that evil often hides in plain sight, cloaked in trust. For many families, placing a loved one in a nursing home is one of the most painful decisions they'll ever make. It requires trust that the caregivers will protect, nurture, and ease the final chapters of life. But in Ontario, Canada, that trust was shattered in the most horrific way. Behind the walls of several long-term care facilities, an unassuming nurse named Elizabeth Wetlaufer quietly became one of Canada's most prolific serial killers. Elizabeth Wetlaufer was born in 1967 in Zora Township, Ontario. From an early age, she struggled with her identity and place in the world. Raised in a strict Baptist household, she often felt isolated and disconnected. Friends described her as awkward, emotional, and prone to mood swings. By the time she reached adulthood, Wetlaufer had developed a complicated relationship with authority and religion. She trained as a nurse, earning her degree in the 1990s, but her career was plagued by instability. She drifted between jobs, often leaving under a cloud of poor performance reviews and complaints about her erratic behavior. She also battled addiction and mental health struggles, including depression. At times, she sought solace in alcohol and prescription drugs. But it wasn't just self-destruction she pursued. Soon, she would channel her inner turmoil outward, onto the very patients she was meant to protect. In 2007, Wetlaufer began working at CareSant Care Nursing Home in Woodstock, Ontario. At first, nothing seemed unusual. She was simply another nurse in a facility where elderly residents lived out their final years. But within those walls, a dark compulsion began to surface. Her first victim was James Silcox, an 84-year-old World War II veteran. Silcox had health complications but was stable. On August 11, 2007, Wetlaufer injected him with a lethal overdose of insulin, a drug readily available in the nursing home. Hours later, he was dead. His death was attributed to natural causes. That same year, she struck again. Her method remained the same: insulin injections delivered in secret. The drug was perfect for her crimes. In small doses, it saved lives. In large doses, it killed silently, mimicking natural complications of diabetes or old age. Over the next 7 years, Wetlaufer murdered at least 8 elderly patients and attempted to kill several others. Her victims were men and women, ranging from their 70s to 90s, most of them frail and vulnerable. Among them was Clotilde Adriano, whom she tried to kill with insulin but who survived. Another was Wayne Hedges, who narrowly escaped death after a suspicious collapse. Others weren't so fortunate. Each time, she blended into the background, offering condolences to grieving families, maintaining the facade of a compassionate caregiver. What drove Elizabeth Wetlaufer remains one of the most chilling aspects of her crimes. Unlike some killers who try to hide their actions, Wetlaufer later confessed that she felt a compulsion, almost an urge she couldn't resist. She described it as a red surge or a voice in her head telling her to kill. She also admitted that part of her motive was a sense of control, the power to decide who lived and who died. In her own words during later confessions, she said, "God wanted it to happen. God was using me." But her interpretation of divine will was twisted beyond recognition. To the families of her victims, she wasn't an instrument of God. She was a predator exploiting trust, masking murder under the guise of care. For years, Wetlaufer got away with murder. Elderly deaths in nursing homes are common, and most of her victims were frail, making it easy for their deaths to be attributed to natural causes. But behind the scenes, her behavior was increasingly erratic. Colleagues noticed she was unreliable, sometimes medicating patients incorrectly, often seeming distracted or unwell. She bounced between jobs at different care facilities, leaving quietly when complaints piled up. Still, no one suspected she was a killer, at least not yet. In 2016, nearly a decade after her first murder, Elizabeth Wetlaufer did something almost unheard of among serial killers. She confessed. After years of carrying her secret, her mental health deteriorated. She checked herself into a psychiatric hospital in Toronto, where she revealed her crimes to staff. At first, they thought she was delusional, exaggerating, or inventing stories. But as she detailed names, dates, and methods, the horrifying truth became clear. Police were called. During interrogations, Wetlaufer gave chillingly calm confessions. She admitted to murdering 8 residents and attempting to kill 6 more between 2007 and 2016. She described her methods, her feelings, even the strange sense of relief she experienced after killing. The sheer brazenness of her confession stunned investigators. Most serial killers fight to hide their crimes. Wetlaufer seemed relieved to unburden herself. In June 2017, Elizabeth Wetlaufer pleaded guilty to 8 counts of first-degree murder, 4 counts of attempted murder, and 2 counts of aggravated assault. The trial was brief but devastating. Families packed the courtroom, listening as the nurse they had once trusted admitted to killing their parents, grandparents, and loved ones. Some wept openly. Others sat in stunned silence, trying to process the betrayal. Prosecutors described Wetlaufer as a predator who exploited her position to commit unspeakable crimes. They argued that she had targeted the most vulnerable, people who could not fight back, who relied entirely on her care. The judge sentenced her to life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years, the maximum sentence under Canadian law. The Wetlaufer case sent shockwaves through Canada. It was the country's largest case of healthcare serial killing ever uncovered. The government launched a public inquiry into how such murders could go unnoticed for nearly a decade. The inquiry's findings were damning. It revealed systemic failures in oversight, poor communication between care homes, and a culture that ignored warning signs. Families demanded reform, and reforms did follow: stricter hiring practices, improved tracking of medication use, and stronger protections for whistleblowers. But for many, it was too little, too late. The damage was already done. For the families of Wetlaufer's victims, the grief was immeasurable. Take the Silcox family, who entrusted their father James to care, believing he would be safe in his final years. Instead, he was poisoned by the very nurse meant to care for him. Or the relatives of Arpad Horvath, a 75-year-old retired bus driver killed by Wetlaufer in 2014. His daughter later described the anguish of realizing her father's death, which she had long accepted as natural, was in fact murder. The betrayal cut deeper than most crimes. These families hadn't lost their loved ones in accidents or random violence. They had lost them in places of supposed safety, at the hands of someone who smiled, reassured, and then killed. Experts who studied Wetlaufer remain divided. Some view her as a classic angel of death, a healthcare worker who kills to satisfy psychological urges. Others see her as a deeply disturbed individual battling mental illness and addiction, whose impulses spiraled out of control. What made her stand out was her confession. Few serial killers willingly turn themselves in. For Wetlaufer, it seemed to stem from overwhelming guilt and a desire to stop herself before killing again. In her own words, "I knew if I didn't tell, I'd do it again." Today, Elizabeth Wetlaufer remains behind bars in Canada, serving a life sentence. She will not be eligible for parole until at least 2041, when she will be in her 70s. For the families of her victims, justice offers some closure, but no true healing. The scars of her crimes remain etched in every empty chair at family gatherings, every memory tainted by betrayal. Elizabeth Wetlaufer's case is a chilling reminder that sometimes the gravest dangers to our loved ones come not from strangers, but from those we trust most deeply. In the quiet halls of Ontario nursing homes, a nurse who promised compassion instead delivered death, proving that even in places of care, evil can thrive in silence.